I'd like to say thank you to Fanya, thank you to the museum for making this wonderful conference possible, and it's certainly an occasion to learn an enormous amount about the Holocaust. I certainly learned quite a lot from the previous talk. I want to begin by mentioning a friend of mine who lives in West Hartford, Connecticut. He's a retired pediatric cardiologist called Leon Cobblowitz. His father was the chief rabbi of Katowice. His parents were in Lviv during the war. They both were killed. And Leon was one of the 150 or so Jewish children who were saved by the Ukrainian Archbishop Andrei Sheptytsky. These were largely, although not exclusively, the children of rabbis and Jewish religious leaders that Sheptytsky knew. Yad Vashem, for reasons of its own, would not give Sheptytsky the posthumous title of Righteous Gentile, which upset Leon quite a lot, but that's not an issue that we have to get into today. Leon was put in a Ukrainian monastery with 3 other boys. So you had 4 random Jewish boys in a monastery. And one of those boys was Adam Rotfeld, who became the foreign minister of Poland. The second boy was Raoul Hoffman, who became a Nobel laureate in chemistry, professor at Cornell University. The third boy was Leon's older brother, who became professor of physics in Australia, and then there was Leon. And when I think about this, and I think about the million Jewish children and young people who were murdered, I think of what might have been. I think of how the world would have been so different had these kids survived. Because all of these murdered children, including many of the siblings of my mother and father, they had parents, they had families, they went to school, they had their hobbies and books, they had dreams for the future. After the murder of the Jews in the tiny ghetto where my mother was, she and her sister ran through the cordon of the Einsatzgruppen and hunted down in the woods, going through many of the experiences that we just heard about, including the choking of a child whose crying was giving a group of people away. They arrived at a house, peasant that they knew, to try to get food and water, and then they saw their own sister, the 15-year-old girl named Chaya, frantically running out of the house, waving her hands, warning them that there were polizei, there were police in the house, and then they saw her shot in the back right in front of them. Chaya, although she came from a religious, observant family, was a fervent member of Hashomer HaTzair, and she had hoped that someday she would be able to go to Israel and live on a kibbutz, and it was not to be. For so long, so many people have had a tendency to see the 6 million as faceless victims, as a mass. But in fact, they were individuals with names. They wanted to be remembered. And as their world crashed around them, many tried to find some meaning in what was happening. And one way to find meaning was to write diaries. Now, for obvious reasons, there are much fewer diaries than there are memoirs. Memoirs are written by people who survived. The diaries that I'm going to discuss in today's talk were written by teenagers who were all killed. And memoirs are also different in that they're written by people who were looking back. They know what happened. Their sense of time is in large part shaped by the identity that they managed to reconstruct or tried to reconstruct after the war. They're developing a narrative that shows how they're endeavoring to make sense and to create a coherent story. A diary, however, is written in real time, day to day, moment to moment. Diaries have a totally different perspective. There's no real story. They don't know what will happen tomorrow. And the diaries reveal, as no other source can, how Jews and young people, as well as adults, try to understand what is happening to them as it's happening. And in that process of trying to understand, we see the role of rumors. We see the role of language, how language in the ghettos especially changes from week to week. We see the role of songs. We see the changing dynamics of family relationships. These diaries of young people also show an intense alternation of hope and fear. There's an anonymous diary which was kept by a young man in the Lodz ghetto. And because paper was so hard to get, he wrote on the margins of a French novel. And he wrote in 4 different languages. He wrote in Polish, he wrote in Yiddish, he wrote in Hebrew, and he wrote in English. And in each language, he expressed himself in a different way. When his first Yiddish entry, Yiddish, I want to apologize to you for having neglected you so long. You're my mama Lushan, I love you so much, and I promise that I'll write more in Yiddish in the future. But most of his entries were in Polish. And even though the Lodz ghetto was the most sealed, the most isolated of all the major ghettos, what's amazing about this diary is how much he knows. He knows about the murder of Hungarian Jewry. He knows about Auschwitz. He knows about Chelmno. He knows not to trust the Germans. He also expresses a deep, haunting, sharp fear of death. He's very afraid of dying. He wants to live. And yet, at the beginning of August 1944, when Bibov, the German commissar of the Lodz ghetto, announces that the Lodz ghetto will be closed, but that the Jews will go to Germany to work, when in fact we know that they were almost all sent to Auschwitz, suddenly he's full of hope. Suddenly he wants to believe that Bibov is telling the truth. He wants so much to live, he doesn't want to die. This diary within the French novel was found in Lodz after the war. We know that young people and children played a special part in the struggle of Jews to survive. They had a special significance. In the Lodz ghetto, Chaim Rumkowski, who was the elder of the Jews and who had, to put it mildly, a very mixed reputation, nonetheless did what he could, as long as he could, to give kids more food, to establish schools, to give young people a chance to practice hachshara, to practice preparation for a life in Palestine after the war. When it came to kids, at least he meant well, and he tried. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the Judenrat and the Jewish police joined the Centos in trying to do something to help these starving kids who were dying on the street. And the secret archive of the Warsaw Ghetto, established by Emanuel Ringelblum, a subject that I've written about, the secret archive devoted an enormous amount of attention to the situation of children and young people. Now, we know about Janusz Korczak. We know how he went with his kids from the orphanage to Treblinka. But he was no exception. Many, many Jewish teachers and caregivers did the same thing. One of those caregivers was a member of the INEC Shabbos, Aaron Kaninsky, who worked with kids in the ghetto. He also accompanied his charges to Treblinka. And Aaron Kaninsky wrote in the INEC Shabbos archive, and I quote, "After all, the child is the holy of holies of any community. Its future, its vitality, its mainstay. The Jewish community must bear responsibility for the state of the younger generation. It should consider no burden too great. It should accept every challenge and effort to save the Jewish child from destruction." And true to the traditions of the Yivo, which inspired the INEC Shabbos, you might say, the INEC Shabbos did all it could to get kids, and especially teenagers, to write about what they were feeling in real time, to give these young people a chance to speak for themselves, to describe their wartime experiences. So in 1941 and 1942, they asked kids to write about the saddest and happiest moments of their life, about what they hoped to do after the war, and there were dozens of responses. There was a 14-year-old named Gil Breitman from Machejowice, and Gil, like the other kids, were the unlucky. You might say that in the Warsaw Ghetto, a lot depended on luck. Now, most people eventually were killed, but before they were killed, their situation in the ghetto in large part depended on dumb luck. What do I mean by that? If you happened to live in Warsaw before the war, and your building was within the space of the future ghetto, you were lucky because you didn't have to move. You had your stuff, you had your clothes. You could sell your possessions little by little to get food. There were people that you knew. You had social networks. Now let's consider a Jew who was wealthy, who was well-to-do, but who lived in a town 50 miles from Warsaw. And the Germans arbitrarily decided that town would be Judenrein. And those Jews were given 15 minutes to pack up and be dumped into the Warsaw Ghetto. No matter how much money and how much intelligence and how much capacity those Jews had, they were basically doomed. They were put in the refugee centers where they suffered a slow death. And these kids belong to that first category of the unlucky. So we come to the 14-year-old Gil Breitman. He's in a refugee center. The windows are broken. There's no coal. It's so cold that the soup freezes by the time it's served to the refugees once a day. His father died of starvation in March 1941. His mother starved to death in June. Hunger tortured me, so I began to smuggle, even though I'd be beaten, and even though once a German gendarme put a rifle to my head and threatened to kill me. So far, I've saved myself by smuggling, but I was not able to help my brothers and sisters. My 17-year-old brother died in February, 41. My sister died in March 1942 of dysentery. My oldest sister is still in the refugee center where she's starving. I don't want to be in this children's home. I feel I have to escape and become a smuggler once again, because otherwise, how am I going to help my sister? If I don't start smuggling, my sister's going to die. My worst memory, the refugee center. My best memory, the Jewish holidays before the war. What does war mean? Hunger. Plans after the war? None. I don't think I'll survive. And then there's the 14-year-old Israel Letterman. He comes from a religious family. Both of his parents have starved to death. He doesn't mind the children's center, but he'd like a more religious atmosphere. His happiest memories before the war were going to Cheder, a Jewish religious school, and the times that his father would take him to see the Gerer Rebbe, who was an important Hasidic leader. And he writes, what does war mean? There are two kinds of war, the war against hunger and the war with bullets. The hunger war is much, much worse because you suffer and you suffer slowly. A bullet will kill you quickly. And then there's the 15-year-old Saras Story. In her worst wartime experience, and I quote, "It was the night Mommy died. I slept beside her in the same bed. During the night, I felt that my mother was cold and stiff, but what could I do? I lay close to her until morning, and then a neighbor helped me carry her out of bed and lay her on the floor." Sarah wrote how she then tried to keep her only sister alive by giving her raw cabbage, but her sister swelled up from hunger and died. Sarah wrote that she'd rather die than beg. She'd seen many bad people during the war. When asked to describe what war meant to her, she replied, "I know it all, but I can't put it into words." Now, one of the things we see here is not just the disappearance of the family, but the disappearance of the family over time. One parent, another parent, a sibling, another sibling, and the child struggling to do all he or she can to keep a brother or a sister alive. Something else we see is that unless you belong to the category of the lucky, at some point your parents, no matter how wonderful they were before the war, no matter how great they were, they're helpless. They can't help you. You have to help them. If you don't risk your life by going to the Aryan side and smuggling, then they will die. And you feel guilty about that, even though it's not your fault. Now, most of us have heard of some famous ghetto diaries kept by adults. The Diary of Emanuel Ringelblum, Herman Kruk, Chaim Kaplan, Abram Lewin. But in these adult diaries, there's a point of view which is focused on history, on the community, on politics, on the wide sweep of events. The diaries of teenagers and young people, in many ways, are very different. The war caught them just as they were beginning to get a sense of who they were. They had not yet begun an independent life. They were defined in large part by the books they read, the schools they attended, and even more so by the intense, sometimes loving, sometimes fraught relationships with parents and siblings. The diaries that I'm about to mention reflect the diverse experiences of young Jews who come from very different backgrounds. It's an irony that while Hitler and the Nazis and many of the German people, much of the German people, saw the Jews as this homogeneous, threatening mass, das Judentum, in fact, these diaries show just how diverse and heterogeneous European Jewry had become by the 1930s. And those who killed these kids cared nothing about their hopes and dreams, their intelligence, their intellectual curiosity, their inner souls. They murdered them only because of some grotesque obsession in which many Germans, and not just Hitler, believed with their heart and soul. The first diary that I want to mention was written by a religious boy from Holland named Moshe Flinker. He came from a well-to-do family, a very wealthy family, as a matter of fact, and their money enabled them to flee to Brussels in Belgium, where they thought that their chances of survival would be much greater. Moshe's father was able to bribe people got identity papers, and he thought that would keep the family safe. But on Passover 1944, as they sat down to celebrate the Seder, the whole family was arrested and sent to Auschwitz, and Moshe and his parents were murdered in the gas chambers, and his diary was found in Brussels after the war. Now, the first thing to notice about Moshe's diary is that even though his native language is Dutch, he writes the entire diary in an excellent Hebrew. And remember, he starts writing it when he's only 15 years old. He mentions the ever-present danger, the frequent fights between his parents, caused in no small part by fear and uncertainty. The diary becomes a refuge, a trusted friend, where he could pour out his heart. This diary shows a boy with a very deep and incredibly deep religious faith and an all-consuming love of the Jewish people. There's absolutely no trace, no scintilla of assimilation and acculturation. He's Jewish, that's it. He's in torment about the rumors of what's happening to the Jews who are being deported. And he even asks, isn't it the more moral thing to do if I voluntarily turn myself over to the Germans so I could share the fate of my fellow Jews? He thinks about Israel. My people and my country do not leave my thoughts for a moment. All day long they are in my mind. He writes about a girl in The Hague that he fell in love with in the early years of the war, but never had the courage to speak to. Where is she now? He wonders. And he feels guilty when he passes a pastry shop and thinks of going in. He recoils in guilt that he could think of his own pleasure while other Jews are suffering. When the war is over, he wants to go to Israel, which obviously is not yet a state, and become, as he says, a statesman of the Jewish people. To that end, every day he studies Arabic because he believes that the children of Abraham and the children of Ishmael will have to find a way to live in peace, and he will do what he can to make that happen. Moshe naturally asks, why is this happening to the Jewish people? And his tortured self-questioning leads him in very strange directions. For example, while 99.99% of all Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe hoped and prayed for Allied victory and for imminent liberation, Moshe believes that if the Allies win the war quickly, then the Jews will thank the Russians and the British rather than Hashem, rather than God. That would only hasten their secularization and assimilation. Instead, he hopes that the Germans gain victory after victory until the final moment when Hashem will intervene, destroy them, and show the Jewish people the power of emunah, of true faith. And I just want to quote a couple words from the diary. I'm sitting at the window and reading the Mincha prayer. I look out and see that all is red. The whole horizon is red. The sky is covered with bloody clouds, and I'm frightened when I see it. I say to myself, where do all those clouds come from? Bleeding clouds, where are you from? Suddenly everything is clear to me. Everything is simple and easily understood. Don't you know? They come from seas of blood. We are the bleeding clouds. We've come to you from the place your brothers are to bring you greetings from your people. We'll soon rise to the heavens before the throne of the Lord of Israel. We will ask him, how much longer? How much longer will he be angry with his chosen people? And the last passages of this diary are the final words of Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem. Now, obviously, this is a very different diary from the diary of Anne Frank, that's much better known. Everybody's heard of Anne Frank. Very few people have heard of Moshe Flinker. Anne came from a very acculturated family. She wrote in Dutch about anybody about things that anybody, Jewish or non-Jewish, could understand. And the phenomenal success of her diary was due in no small part to the fact that, as we know, her father censored and abridged the diary and took out many of the passages which in fact dealt with her Jewish identity. And this made the diary much more universal and much more accessible. And when the diary was turned into a play, the reviewers in the New York Times approvingly quoted the lines, despite everything at heart, I believe that all people are good. That made it into a feel-good experience. Would Anne have written those words had she had a chance to write in Bergen-Belsen? I don't know, but I doubt it. And the play, when it was shown in Germany in the 1950s, one lady was so moved that upon leaving the theater, she exclaimed, "Ach, that poor girl, at least she deserved to live." Now, in the last few years, another diary has surfaced by a young man named Peter Ginn, who was born in 1928. The only thing that Peter had in common with Moshe Flinker was incredible intelligence and the fact that the Germans deemed that neither was worthy to live. Peter's father was Jewish. His mother was Czech. His parents were obviously very liberal and intellectually independent people. After all, they met at an Esperanto conference. They had a very happy marriage, and Peter and his sister grew up in Prague, knowing about their Jewish background, but without any fixed Jewish identity. What happened to them next, after the Germans occupied Prague, was determined by how the Nazis and their legal experts chose to treat Jews in mixed marriages. Peter's father had to wear a Jewish star, but was spared deportation because he was married to an Aryan. His children, though, were first-degree Mischlinge, or mongrels, half-breeds. And that meant that when Peter and his sister turned 14, they were taken from their parents and deported to Theresienstadt. And in September 1944, Peter was sent to Auschwitz and gassed. He was 16 years old. His parents survived, as did his teacher, as did his sister, Peter was full of energy and intellectual curiosity. He was a gifted poet and a phenomenal artist, leaving over 150 paintings and drawings. Many of the paintings he made in Prague and Theresienstadt survived. He was fascinated by science fiction and by his favorite writer, Jules Verne. One of his many paintings was entitled Moonscape. Now, you might remember the story of Ilan Ramon, the Israeli astronaut who perished in 2002. Ramon's mother had been in Auschwitz, and before he went into space, he asked Yad Vashem for something connected with the Holocaust that he could take with him into space. And Yad Vashem gave him a copy of Peter's drawing, Moonscape. And after news of the disaster, a Czech living in Prague contacted Peter's sister in Israel and came forward with a copy of his diary that he found in his apartment after the war. Now, this was a kid who loved to play pranks and practical jokes. He made toy cap pistols. He made exploding pencils. He was fascinated with rockets and space travel. He also had incredible self-discipline and a strong moral compass. The polar opposite of Moshe Flinker, he was not religious. Peter, nonetheless, had a Jewish identity, which became more pronounced in Theresienstadt, although it was an identity rooted in a deep love for Prague and for Czech culture rather than Zionism. No sooner did he arrive in Theresienstadt at the age of 14 then he founded an amazing magazine called Vedam, or In the Forefront, in Czech. And he and other boys published poems, essays, satire. And every Friday night when the kids in his dormitory got together for a Friday night meal, they read the weekly edition. One copy was made, the whole journal was found after the war, and it runs to 800 pages. And at Peter's initiative, they organized themselves into a community called the Republic of Szkid. And the Republic of Szkid endeavored to be an island of humanity and decency in a terrible world. And Peter even wrote the anthem of the Republic of Szkid, which was sung before every meeting, every Friday night. Every man is our brother, Christian or Jewish kid. United we march under the banner of the Republic of Szkid. Insult us no one shall dare to hit. To work hard we swear, to honor the Republic of Szkid. And Peter wrote, the Germans have only one aim in mind, to destroy us, not only physically, but mentally and morally as well. Will they succeed? Never. The last entry he made before he was deported to Auschwitz was what he'd been reading and doing the week before. Besides lithographs and drawings, he read Thomas Mann, Dickens, Descartes, Oscar Wilde, and a biography of Rembrandt. Now, the world of kids from Poland, from Eastern Europe, was very, very different from the world of Jewish kids in Western and Central Europe. And the diaries I'm now going to talk about, David Sarakowiak from Lodz and Jacek Rudaszewski from Vilna, they reflect the very different conditions that Jews lived in Poland. These teenagers from Poland were part of a generation that was upended by incredible shocks and changes: anti-Semitism, conflicts with parents, economic hardship. Poland, on the one hand, didn't want them, but on the other hand, 80% of Jewish kids were getting an education in the Polish language and learning the culture and values of a nation that told them that they were inferior. And there was it's no surprise that many of these kids took refuge in youth movements, in reading, in radical politics. And without those youth movements, which were so strong among young people in Poland, without the intense idealism of that generation, there would have been no uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, there would have been no resistance movements in Vilna or in Białystok. David Sarakowiak from Lodz was born in 1924. He came from a very poor family. Before the war, he was active in a Zionist youth movement. He kept his diary in Polish, but he wrote poetry in Yiddish, and he described how he gave an entire lecture on Tisha B'Av in Hebrew. Like so many other Jewish kids in pre-war Poland, he suffered terribly from the growing poverty of his parents. He got a partial scholarship to go to high school, but when his father couldn't pay the reduced tuition on a humiliating way, he was taken out of the school in front of all the other students and told to stay out until his father could come back and pay what was owed. The diary is a heartbreaking document that describes the day-by-day, week-by-week, slow-motion collapse of a family and finally of David himself. In the first part of the diary, David is full of intellectual energy and curiosity. He abandons Zionism and joins a communist youth group, complete with a Politburo, to which he is not elected. He translates Lenin's State and Revolution into Yiddish, And he treasures his chance to go to a ghetto school organized by Rumkowski. And he writes about every book that he reads and every good grade that he gets. But conditions in the Lodz ghetto get steadily worse. In October 1941, when 20,000 German and Czech Jews are dumped in the Lodz ghetto, Rumkowski is forced to close the schools. And David is forced to work. And now we begin to see the effects of hunger. In the Lodz ghetto, there was very little smuggling. In the Warsaw ghetto, 90% of the food was smuggled in. In the Lodz ghetto, you ate what the Germans allowed you to eat, and that was it. And we see the diary showing how David's mind is changing, how he's becoming more and more obsessed with food. And we see his growing bitterness at his father, who was by and large a loving person before the war, is now so crazed with hunger that he begins to steal food from the rest of the family. David's mother voluntarily gives up part of her food ration to keep the father happy. Because David's mother is so weakened, she is taken during the terrible Sperre, during the terrible selection of September 1942. She's taken to Chelmno. David blames that on his father, and relations between father and son totally collapse. A few months later, the father dies of starvation, and David is left alone with his sister. And hunger and sickness finally claim David, who dies in the summer of 1943. The diary of Yitzhak Rudashevsky is, in many instructive ways, very, very different from David Sarakowiak's diary. Yitzhak Rudashevsky is from Vilna, and he writes his diary in Yiddish. And you could see here that in Vilna, because of tradition, because of history, because of collective memory, you see a Jewish society that is much less divided by class, language, and culture than was the case in Lodz and Warsaw. We see here how the intense and creative cultural life of the ghetto helped keep Yitzhak going. And we also see in this diary the great importance of mentorship, adults coming forward to teach these kids, to give them a sense of self-worth. And we also see that this is all possible because once the Vilna ghetto stabilized, after 2/3 of the Jews were already killed, but once the Vilna ghetto stabilized in January 1942, for all the problems in the ghetto, Jews, by and large, had enough to eat, more to eat than in Lodz. So the diaries did not reflect this growing obsession with food that you have, say, in diaries from Lodz. We have David's describing his desire to live. I wish to shout to time, to linger, not to run. I wish to recapture my past year and keep it for later, for the new life. My second feeling today is that of strength and hope. I do not feel the slightest despair. Today I became 15 years of age, and I feel confident in the future. I'm not conflicted about it, and I see before me son and son and son. And he was shot in September 1943. But in this diary, we see a very interesting fact that in the Vilna ghetto, there were great attempts to make teenagers feel valued and important. One of the most popular plays in the ghetto theater was entitled Pesha fun Resha. Pesha is a teenage girl who's lost her parents, but she has a lot of grit and she's determined to survive. And the song in this musical play, which Pesha keeps singing, is Weil ich habe a Charakter, sich in Ergetz nicht verlier, weil ich habe a Charakter wie a Gilgul liegt in mir, which means because I have such a character, I never get fazed by anything. I have a character as if some dibuk, as if some other soul has lived in me and will keep me going. And then there was the song of youth, composed by the poet Shmerka Kaczerginski. To everyone with courage who'll take a daring stand, we young people of the ghetto extend a helping hand. He was also encouraged and mentored by the great Yiddish poet Avram Sutzkever, who believed that poetry and beauty could in the end overcome death. The last diary I want to mention in any detail, how am I doing on time? Okay. The last diary I want to mention in any detail is a diary by Justynia Dranger from Krakow. She gives us a real sense of what it was like to be in a close-knit youth movement. In this case, Akiba. And these Jewish youth movements were a way of giving Jewish kids self-respect and a feeling of personal worth at a time when Polish society was telling them that they were not valued. The youth movements became a second family. They sponsored libraries, amateur theater, and in the Vilna and Warsaw ghettos, as I said, they became a focus of resistance. Now, Justina describes in her diary how her youth movement has the Last Supper. They would meet every Friday night, light candles over white tablecloths, and come together. And that Last Supper, before they all dispersed, the leader of her movement said, "We're on a journey of no return. The road we've chosen is the road to death. Remember that. Whoever hopes to survive must not seek survival among us or in our work. We've reached the road's end, but it's not an end that will plunge us into darkness. We face the angel of death, but we'll face him as bold idealists." I have a feeling this is the last time we'll greet the Sabbath together. It was that youth movement, and it was the young man that she married that carried out an attack on a German officers' club in Krakow in December 1942, in which a number of German officers were killed. When the Gestapo arrested her husband, Justina voluntarily turned herself in to the Germans, hoping to be with him to the very end. In a death cell in Montepellier prison, on toilet paper, she wrote her journal. Now, since I don't have time, I'm going to skip over quite a lot of what I intended to say. But I just want to end this by reading a poem written by a young man in the Lodz ghetto, Avram Cobblowitz, and he wrote this at 14, and that's when he was killed in Auschwitz. "When I grow up and get to be 20, I'll travel and see this world of plenty. I'm a bird with an engine. I will sit myself down, take off, fly into space, far above the ground. I'll fly and cruise and soar up high, above a world so lovely into the sky, and so delighted by all the world's charms into the heavens. I will take off and not have a bother. The cloud is my sister, the wind is my brother." Thank you.